Hello, Rune Scholar, wherever and whenever you are. I'm the modern Erilar. When scholars consider how to spell words using runes, some scholars have referred to runic spelling as orthophonic, which means that the writing reflects pronunciation and spoken language to a much greater degree than does modern English. Svante Lagman analyzed the occurrences of misspellings in Viking Age Old Swedish and concluded that rune writers were simply recording what they heard in the spoken language, and that actual spelling mistakes were negligible. Other scholars discuss whether traditional spellings existed, which represent a customary set of rules. Terrius Birkeland indicated that systematic discrepancies in spelling, when compared with contemporary Latin alphabet spellings, indicated that rune carving followed different rules than the Latin alphabet. Stephanie Bauer has pointed out that runic spelling practices were followed even when texts in the Latin language were executed in runes. But both positions do seem to argue that runic spelling as a system aligned with pronunciation. So today, let's summarize the spelling trends that we can observe that align with pronunciation. When writing in the Elder Futhark, as much as we can make conclusions from a tiny number of inscriptions, there seems to have been a near one-to-one correspondence between the sounds of the spoken language and the runes. The voiced and the voiceless variants of the same type of consonant have different rune signs or graphemes. So the g and the k sound, which are the voiced and the voiceless variant of the same type of consonant, these have gebu and kaunas, respectively. There are different runes for these sounds. These rune writers also hardly ever indicated long or geminated vowels or consonants by doubling the rune that represented the sound. Rune writers also dropped nasal consonants when they came before a consonant that's made in the same part of the mouth. So they would not have written a mon rune before a björko, so the M and the B sound are made in the same part of the mouth. They are homorganic, and they would have dropped the M when it's written before the B sound. We also don't have much evidence for differences in spelling or dialect across the Proto-Scandinavian speaking world, and that would have been the language that the Elder Futhark recorded, but that may be due to the short nature of most inscriptions that survive from Elder Futhark. Once we start to transition from Elder to Younger Futhark, we can observe syncope, which contracts a word over time through the loss of a vowel, a letter, or entire syllables. And this can also correlate to more informal speech. So in modern spoken English, we can see an example in the difference between the spelling and the pronunciation of the word memory, which in many dialects doesn't have the O pronounced out loud, but the O is still typically spelled when it's written. Or if we use an example from informal speech, we're gonna do something rather than we are going to. And if we represent gonna phonetically, it takes fewer letters than going to as a phrase. In some runic inscriptions of this period, we also observe vowel reduction, which weakens the quality of a vowel in various ways. But the most typical result is a schwa sound, like the I in pencil is a very common example of the schwa. And as an example, in runes, the phrase mighty runes, gibu runas, is written gino ronos in the Stentoften stone. So the phrase ginu ronas starts to experience vowel reduction and is written gina runas on the Björketorp stone. So the U U sound softens into an ah sound through vowel reduction. And both these changes, syncope and vowel reduction, are observable in the written material and reflect an oral character to the inscriptions that are recorded in the Elder Futhark. Once rune writers switched to Younger Futhark just before the Viking Age, we lose the one-to-one correspondence between the sounds of the spoken language and the runes. Spelling in Younger Futhark does appear to have been reasonably consistent when it comes to the spelling of individual sounds. Most of the consonants are straightforward to choose, but Younger Futhark does not distinguish between the voiced and the voiceless consonants. So the g and the k sounds, we no longer have gebo, we just have kaun, and the g and the k use that same rune kaun to represent this sound that's made in the same part of the mouth. So the d and the t use the tir rune, the b and the p both use the Björk rune. So it can start to get confusing. The vowels are even less intuitive to choose. The is rune can appear for both I and E sounds in the language. The ur rune can represent any of the front rounded vowels, which include o, u, y, and ö. And it can also stand in for a V consonant as well, just to be extra confusing. There are two runes that represent A sounds, the R rune and the O's. So the former is typically used for regular open vowels like A, and and the latter are used for the nasalized version of the same three sounds. And if you're interested in why the A vowels shifted over time, I go into more depth on that in episode 5 on Anglo-Frisian. In the Viking Age, they did start to double letters if the same sound ended one word and started the next. Doubled runes appeared increasingly often, mainly from the 12th to the 14th centuries, as I've mentioned quite a few times now. And doubled consonants, I can also point out, also appeared more frequently in inscriptions containing Latin than in those containing the vernacular language only, though again, usage was far from consistent. Rune writers did typically still continue to drop nasal consonants before homorganic sounds well into the medieval period, though some nasal consonants were written. Again, consistency. One feature that tells us that words written in the Younger Futhark were spelled the way they were spoken is the rendering of a fricative G, a y sound, with this star rune, which was also used for the H sound. And we can see an example of this at Altrol Stave Church in inscription N151, where Sundag, the word for Sunday, was written right here. We've dropped that nasal N before the T, which is homorganic, but it's also spelled with the star rune. The Sundag is much less present than dag here in the language, so it's written with a final H. And in Trondheim, the word magister is written with a star rune instead of a kaun when it's spelled here. So again, it's much more continuant than it would be a plosive consonant here. So the pronunciation is much softer, and we're using a different rune to represent that sound. More evidence appears in the work of the prolific rune carver Uppir, who signed around 50 runestones from around the area of Uppland in Sweden. And from the spelling patterns in Uppir's work, we can see that he abbreviates some words by not carving the last runes. So he writes rune for runar and sin for sinnar. Magnus Källström pointed out that ending R's or that sound may have started to disappear from the language at this point. So Uppir may just have been writing what he heard in the pronunciation of the people around him. We definitely observe differences in spelling for what we can read as the same word. And when that occurs, the variations fall into several different categories. Some frequently written words appear in multiple instances without a specific rune, and it's usually a vowel. And this may represent a commonly accepted spelling of that specific word. At O Church, the rune writer has used thornwraith for the word there, and Björkwraith thornwraith for the word brother. Abbreviations per se do not seem to have been a standardized practice in runic writing, but leaving out just one or two vowels may have been reasonable, at least on the local level. When representing different vowel sounds or pairs, different rune writers seem to have made differing choices in how to either represent or pair those vowel sounds to represent the same underlying word. So in the case of the word stone, stein, rune writers could spell it stin, stein, sten, or stein, and each one of these varying spellings of the word stone comes from the island of Bornholm, which is relatively small. So it's a fairly tight geographic area for this number of alternative spellings of the word stone. We can also observe the addition of extra or epenthetic vowels between consonants. So instead of writing brother, multiple rune writers have written brother, adding that extra initial vowel. Then we have other variants that may have had a linguistic rationale, like the addition or subtraction of an initial H sound. And as an example, the writer of the Valby runestone in Vestfold wrote what is probably the name Havarder without the initial H. And elsewhere, near Stavanger, the writer of runestone N251 spelled the word efter with an initial H, whereas most rune writers would not have spelled it with that initial H. So this may again be a local variation of the way that this word is pronounced. And while we need to be careful about what we take from these patterns, because we've got no living native speakers of the language of the late Germanic Iron Age whose pronunciation we can study, and the dating of runestone inscriptions tends to be very broad. We might conclude that the different ways of writing the same word may reflect regional differences in how to pronounce specific words, that pronunciation shifted over time, or that different people in the same community pronounce the same words differently. Potato to potato, tomato, you get it. But even if we don't know precisely why spelling differences occurred in Younger Futhark for the same words, we can identify trends. We can even observe a distinct, almost systematic set of spelling rules for Latin texts executed in runes as opposed to those written in the Latin alphabet. Terry Sperkland tells us that, and I'm going to quote a fairly long quote here, the deviations from manuscript Latin are so regular that it would be correct to talk about a special runic Latin tradition or a particular runic orthography for Latin. The same holds true for runic inscriptions in the vernacular. The deviations from the language found in Scandinavian manuscripts are very consistent, and the reason might be that the carvers felt free to adapt spelling to their pronunciation. So, if, like he says, medieval writers who were rendering Latin in runes had their own rules for spelling, what did those rules look like? Let's go back. So when rendering mid-front unrounded vowels like the in exe or the a in excelsis. This was sometimes but not always expressed in runic inscriptions according to pronunciation. The dotted e's frequently, but again, there's not consistency, frequently represented a short e, a close mid front unrounded vowel, close mid front unrounded vowel. Yes, I got that correct. And the long branch version of the or rune, to differentiate it, very frequently came to be pronounced as the long a, an open mid front unrounded vowel. Like e came to be pronounced in Latin during the medieval period. That's why we say excelsis, gloria in excelsis Deo, as opposed to excelsis and exi, like classical Latin, because the pronunciation changes. And we can see examples of these in the word versum in an inscription from Lom Stave Church, which uses the long branch or rune. And then a rune stick from Bryggen uses the dotted e's in the word mete. So both of these are absolutely acceptable, but we do tend to have a differentiation between and a whenever we're representing those in runes, even when they're in the Latin language. One of the developments that affected medieval Latin across Europe is the lenition of the T sound when it ends words after unaccented vowels. What does this even mean? Et turns into ed. Rune writers transcribing the Latin word et would then transliterate this into runes either as eighth or eighth rather than et. So again, we see the open mid front unrounded vowel, and in Scandinavia they use the voice dental fricatives, either the thorn rune or an eighth version of this, to soften the sound of the T in the word et. And when rendering the Latin letter C, in medieval Latin, the C had two pronunciations, much like modern English does. So there's the sibilant sound for the C, and then a voiceless velar plosive k. And in Scandinavia, rune writers typically differentiated these according to how they're pronounced. So again, while exceptions to this rule definitely exist, rune writers typically rendered C using either the knesol or the kaun rune according to whether it sounded like an S or like a K. So according to the palatal rule. And we can see this illustrated in that same rune stick from Bryggen in the words ducite, where it sounds like an S, and discrete, where the C sounds like a K. They've used different runes for differently pronounced Latin C letters. And while multiple scholars have confirmed that rune writers' use of dotted runes was far from consistent, Anita Carlson, in her master's thesis on dotted runes from Norwegian runic inscriptions, she concluded that dotted runes were used more frequently in runic inscriptions that wrote in the Latin language than in runic inscriptions in the native vernacular only. And this was later confirmed by Alessandro Palumbo to apply to Old Swedish inscriptions as well, where dotted rune usage increased between the 12th and the 13th centuries. So again, increasing over the medieval period. And according to Carlson, this may have been because the rune carvers who were inscribing that Latin may have also been accustomed to writing Latin using the alphabet. So just to sum all this up, the evidence from runic inscriptions across centuries suggests that runic spelling was deeply influenced by pronunciation, a trend often described as orthophonic. Early Elder Futhark inscriptions showed a strong sound to symbol correspondence, while in the Viking Age and the medieval period, variation and shifting pronunciation likely contributed to spelling differences that we can observe, even within the same word. While the exact motivations between specific spellings that underlie that remain pretty speculative. The evidence can indicate a flexible but rule-governed system that gives us a prioritization of the phonetic reality over some kind of a rule set. So if you want to write your own runes, even and maybe especially if you're not writing in Old Norse, know that previous rune writers chose to make themselves understood by relying on the sound that the rune makes to communicate their meaning, and you can do that too. So thank you for writing the runes with me, the modern Erilar.